study of David as he battles the giant in his life, another giant. A man learns that his father is in the hospital and may not live. When he arrives at the hospital, his father is in the process of dying. He is able to talk with him, he's able to share with him, and he's able to right some wrongs that were made along the road of life. Soon after, his father dies, and the son begins a time of grieving. A young child sits holding the dog she has had for years. The dog, though old, is still a major part of her life. The dog has waited on her to come home from school. It has played in the yard with her, and it has smiled at her. Now the dog is needing to be held. Soon the dog's age will catch up with it. A few hours later, the child begins to grieve the loss of a best friend. A man walks into the workplace the same way he has walked into work every day for the past 7 years. He takes a seat at his desk and waits for the day to begin like he has done for 7 years. Before the first customer comes through the door, the boss walks through the door and asks him to come into his office. It's not that he's done a bad job. It's just that he is not one of the priorities of the workplace any longer. His job is being taken away. At closing time, the man walks out of the office, grieving a lifestyle he has known since he was married. What do these three people have in common? These three people are all dealing with the giant we are focusing on tonight, and that is the giant of grief. We have all experienced grief before. We have all lost someone or something really close to us. We have all lost something or someone who has been a part of our lives for quite some time. And once they are gone, we begin this process known as grief. Tonight we continue journeying with David as he battles different giants in his life. Over the past few weeks we have seen David not be called when Samuel arrived at his house. He was the youngest, he was the baby of the family, and he was left to the side until Samuel asked Jesse for a chance to see the youngest son. David has battled also the raging Sauls in his life. He has been chased. He has been mistreated. He has been physically challenged as he has been tested as Saul has tried to kill him. He's hunted him down and he's tracked him down. The desire or want to get even with someone for hurting you physically, emotionally, or spiritually. Revenge. It is a giant David had to face. And he had every right to allow the giant of revenge to control him, but he defeated that giant as well. And last week we talked about the giant David faced called the giant of the slump. It's a time when we get into a weird state of mind and we do things and we say things that are totally out of character for us. And David had to face the giant of the slump as he physically got tired of running and hiding from Saul. And tonight we look at one of David's biggest giants yet. We look at a time when David is facing something he's yet to face in his journey. And that is this giant of grief. But David doesn't hear that his father has died. David doesn't hear that a pet is dying. Nor does David hear that he has lost his job. But this is what David learns. Look with me. 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 4. A man comes up to David and says, and David asks him, "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle, He, being the man who brought the news, replied, "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. You see, David has arrived in town after taking down the Amalekites. And this man comes up to him, and this man is dirty, and this man has dust all over him. He has torn clothes, and if you know the stories in the Bible, when someone mourns or if someone is grieving, one of the things they do is they put dirt on themselves and they tear their clothes as a sign of mourning or a sign of grieving or a sign of dealing with the loss that has taken place in their life. Well, David sees this man coming up to him, and this man falls down to pay his respect to David. And that's when David asks him, he says, "Hey, what's going on? What's happened? Why do you have dirt on you? Why do you have torn clothes?" David knew something bad had happened in this man's life. He knew there was something taking place in his life that he was really struggling with. And so David asked him what happened. And then this man was actually an Amalekite that David had been fighting. He comes to David to tell him the worst news David could ever hear. He told him that Saul and Jonathan being David's very best friend, have been killed. And they're no longer there. They are both dead. Now, while David may have had a hard time believing that they were actually dead, the man takes Saul's crown and Saul's bracelet, and he shows them to David. And immediately grief begins to build up in David, and he begins to battle this giant, and he starts to deal with the grief process much like we have to do many times in life. You see, these were the two most important people in David's life. You say, well, how can this be? Because Saul was trying to kill David. Well, remember, when David had a chance to kill Saul in the cave, David just cut his robe. And when he had a chance to kill him with the spear, he didn't do it. And he told the man with him not to do it. Why? Because what David saw in Saul was a person who was anointed and appointed by God. And while Saul was after David, and while Saul was trying to kill David, David still knew this is the king. This is the one God has anointed and God has appointed. And so this person, Saul, was very important in David's life. And we don't have to go very deep to understand how important Jonathan was to David. I mean, Jonathan was his best friend. Jonathan was the one who told David, "My dad's after you. My dad's trying to kill you, but I'm not going to let him do that. I'll take care of you. I'll tell you when he's coming. I'm not going to let him kill you. I'm going to be there for you." And now David is left without either of these two men. He was in full-blown grief mode. So how do we handle grief when it comes our way? When we see this giant of grief looking at us and staring at us and dealing with us, how do we deal with it? Well, there's some people who try to ignore grief. It would be easier to change the subject. It would be easier to deal with another situation. It would be easier to change a conversation than to deal with the pain and the confusion of death and grief. It's easier to walk away from grief than to face it head on. After all, when we talk about grief, when we talk about loss, when we talk about mourning, all it does is brings back all that pain and all that emotion and all that hurt. So what good does it do to do that? It would be better to change the subject. Well, Max Lucado, the person who wrote the book that I'm dealing with when we talk about these giants in our lives, Max Lucado says this: "We only hurt ourselves when we try to ignore grief, and we only hurt ourselves because of what bereavement does to us." Now, we know what bereavement means. It's, the process of grieving and mourning loss. And says, when we do that, here's what happens. Bereavement has within it, in the middle part of that, the word reave, R-E-A-V-E. And the word reave means to take away by force or to rob. And that's exactly what death, that's exactly what loss, that's exactly what happens when someone or something is taken away from us. It takes away the very things that mean the most to us. It robs us of more life and more joy. It jerks those memories away from us, and it jerks all the life's pictures away from us. Grief, if we are not careful, can take over our lives, our total lives. It affects every part of our lives. And you can understand that because if you've ever grieved, and I know you have, if you've ever dealt with loss, and I know you have, you understand that there are some days physically you just can't get going. It's just too heavy, it's too hard. And spiritually it kind of blocks your relationship with God because you have all these questions and all these things you're trying to understand and make sense out of. And emotionally you just can't think. You can't get things together. Grief. It can control every part of our life. I don't know if you've ever experienced it or not, but maybe you've heard a song, or you watched a TV show, or you smelled a certain smell, and all of a sudden that person or those people or whatever you're grieving over comes right back to you, and the pain returns. You see, I've experienced this a lot because I've lost both of my parents, and this past week my aunt passed away, and she was the last person on my dad's side that we care for, and so there will be no more caring for people as far as we know, because the other family members on my mom's side have children and stuff to take care of them. And so we won't deal with that anymore, but I know I've experienced this, especially with my father. You know, he was like my best friend, and we did a whole lot of stuff together. Every Monday we would play golf together. And I know that when he passed away, I was like, yeah, I'm going to go play golf in memory of Dad. And so I remember getting in the golf cart and going to the golf course, and it was like the first shot I hit, I was like, this isn't right. You know, this just isn't right. I remember I would hit a shot and I could hear his voice, and you know, I could see him sitting in the golf cart and all this stuff, and it's just things just come back. And now he passed away in 1997. So it's been 18 years ago since he passed away, and still today when I go and play golf, I can hear the things he said. I can hear him laugh at me when I hit one in the woods. And so I'm in the cart going, hush, Dad. You know, I can just hear him. And there's smells from, you know, kitchens and stuff that's just my mom's smell, and food and things like that. It's just, that's the way grief is. Grief is always there. And there will be certain times that it'll just come flooding back and rushing back, and it will just hurt again, and we have to deal with it again. So what we need to understand is, if all of this is going to happen, if all of this is going to come back to us, then we cannot ignore it. We have to understand that we can't get away from the feelings of reality of grief. Sure, we can change the subject. And man, it would have been so easy for me tonight to go to something else, have to look at the table of contents and find something happy and fun to deal with, but it's there. David dealt with it. So we have to deal with it. We can change the subject, but it keeps coming back up in conversations. We can try to keep from facing the fact that the loved ones that we've lost are gone, but they are. They are gone until we can see them again in heaven. Life has indeed changed, and the sooner we can face it, the sooner we can move on in the grief process. So one thing we need to do is not try to ignore it, not try to put it aside, but deal with it. Deal with it in our own way and in our own time. We can do what David did when he faced the giant of grief. Let's look at what he did. Beginning in 2 Samuel 1:17, this is what David did when he learned about Jonathan, when he learned about Saul. This is what happened. David took up his lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan. Now, lament basically means emotionally mourning or emotionally grieving. Probably what happened was David began to cry. David began to weep over the fact that he found out these two guys, his best friend and his father, had passed away. He passionately showed emotion. Look at what else happened when the news of Saul And David and Jonathan came to him. 2 Samuel 1, 11 and 12. Then David and all the men, now all the men being all the people with David, all those who followed David, all those who marched with David, then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. Remember, that's a sign of mourning in the Bible. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. One of the things David did is David made sort of like a decree or rule. This is going to be a time of mourning for Saul and Jonathan. So he got all of his men, got everybody around, and they began to mourn together. You know, if you remember when Jerome and Dora passed away, you remember the Friday night we had. That's exactly what we had to do. That's what David had to do. David had to call the people into a time of mourning. Why? So they could deal with it. So they could face it. So they could come to reality with the grips of reality that this has happened in our lives. You see, until we get to the point where we can totally accept it, we're not going to deal with it. And David knew that. So they began to do the things that shows we now understand it. They tore clothes. They began to fast. They began to mourn so they could see that this had really happened in their lives. Mighty soldiers, brave soldiers, strong soldiers brought to their knees when this news of death had come to them. You see, grief causes the deepest part of our emotions to come out. And that's okay. I think that's something we really, really need to understand. Is that when we lose someone or something so close to us, it brings about a lot of emotion that we may not expect. And folks, that is okay. It's okay to be emotional over loss because we need this type of cleansing in our lives. The soldiers needed that emotion. They needed the pain. They needed that anger. They needed all these things that were taking place. They needed to get it out in the open. And they needed to cleanse their inner beings. You know, we can probably think of other people in the Bible who wept. For example, there was a person who died named Lazarus, and we know that Jesus went to Lazarus, and the Bible tells us Jesus wept. Jesus wept. He cried because Lazarus was dead before he brought him back to life. He saw his friend there. Jesus also cried over Jerusalem. As he came in, he looked out over Jerusalem and began to cry for them. Peter wept when Jesus died. You see, crying is a form of emotion that allows others to see that we're hurting and we're dealing with it. And sometimes we get uncomfortable with that. We don't want others to see we're hurting. However, having something or someone taken away from us is painful. And it does hurt. And we can't deny it, so we need to face it head on, as David did. It's a giant in our lives, but we can defeat it. There's something else we need to do, and that is we need to allow ourselves time. We can't rush through grief. Grief is not a temporary part of our lives. Grief is lifelong. Grief is something that will never go away, but it will be made easier with time. It's not done overnight. It's not processed or worked through at the same speed for everyone. And you see, something really interesting takes place when we're in the middle of mourning or grieving. During this process, what happens is we begin to evaluate our lives. I think everybody can testify to that when we lose someone close to us, it causes us to be shaken a little bit, and we begin to think about our lives. What am I doing? Is it worth it? You know, do I need to spend more time with family? What do I need to do more and more? It causes us to evaluate our lives. We might want to examine where we are and what we're doing, and that's okay. In David's life, as he mourned and took time to mourn, we can see some real struggles that he was going through. Look at what it says in Psalm 6:6. I am worn out from my groaning. Anybody ever been so much into grief that you're just exhausted? Oh yeah, absolutely. Grief wipes us out. Grief makes us so tired. Look what it said, all night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. We've probably been there. We probably know exactly what David's feeling. We know what it means to mourn and to hurt like that. He's totally worn out. He's totally exhausted. Look what else. He says, Psalm 31:10, my life is consumed by anguish, and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak. I mean, think about this. This is David. This is the guy that's going to be king, and he's hurting. He's grieving so much that he is feeling so weak. You know, there are people who feel that they should be able to continue to do what they've always done in the face of grief. Share an experience real quick with you. When I went to the funeral of my aunt this week, funeral service was Friday, and we had visitation Friday at 1. And there was this man that came through the line during visitation. And we knew him, all the family knew him. And we were talking to him, and he was a really nice guy, one of our family, distant cousin to me, I guess. And he was talking to us, and somebody came up to us and said, don't know if you know it or not, but his wife died yesterday, and they're going to bury her 2 days from now. And this guy was at the visitation and at the funeral, even in the loss of his wife the day before. You know, some people feel like, I've just got to move on, I've got to get on, because that helped me with the grieving process. And that's okay if you can do that. If you can't, it's okay as well. Some people feel like they need to go on to work and deal with things, be as social as always. But you know, we have to make sure we take care of ourselves. Life is not as usual when we're grieving. It's different, and it's okay if it's different. Give ourselves time to grieve and feel what we feel. David gave the nation a song of mourning and called them into a time of mourning. And we know in the Bible it says there is definitely a time of mourning. Ecclesiastes 3:1 and 4. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to weep and a time to laugh. Scripture tells us we do have times in our lives when we need to grieve and we need to hurt. This past week, I didn't do a good job of preaching to myself. Preachers often ask, or people often ask me as a pastor, they say, you know, do you ever preach to yourself? And I'm like, yeah, but I don't always listen. You know, and this week was one of those weeks because I worked in Pinehurst and I got news of my aunt's passing on Monday. And so I worked on her funeral on Tuesday. And then Wednesday I worked on my sermon for Sunday morning on Wednesday. And then Thursday I went to Pinehurst and I worked on her funeral. And then I went to Hickory and worked on Sunday night sermon. And then Friday I got up and went to the visitation and sang at her funeral and preached her funeral. And then Saturday we went to Raleigh and celebrated my wife's mom's birthday. And then Saturday night I went and covered the South Granville volleyball match, the state championship. Saturday night, got to bed at 2:45 last night and got up and preached this morning and here tonight. And you know, I didn't do a good job of listening to myself. Because what God tells us to do is take care of yourself. Somebody told me, said, you ever heard the word no? You know, can you use that word? And I said, no. So, you know, sometimes we just have to take care of ourselves. Sometimes we just have to say, you know what? I've done all I can do. I'm spent. I'm exhausted. And I just need to rest. That's just what David had to go through. David had to deal with it. So we need to allow ourselves time. And what I did Monday when I got word that my aunt died, you know, I was close to my aunt, but it wasn't super close because I was the youngest in the family. But I did go every couple months and sing to her. And the song I sang at the funeral yesterday, she told me in 2002 she wanted me to sing at the funeral. So I've been practicing for 13 years, that song. And my family told me after the funeral, said, you did good, you should have, you know, after 13 years of practice. But when I got the news on Monday, I was traveling, and I was like, I'm not really emotional, but it's sad. And so what I began to do is sing that song that I sang at the funeral. I sang it Monday in the car, and emotion began to come because we had done it before, we had sung that before. So I knew I needed to deal with it. And I knew I needed to sing that song before Friday because I knew what would happen. And so I did that, and I began to grieve and to mourn in my own special way. So we need to allow ourselves time to do this. But finally, what we need to do is we need to celebrate the fact that if that person that we lose is a Christian, they're better off than we are by a long shot. And we will see them again. They're in heaven. They're free from pain. And then we are promised we will see them again. I had a friend who lost his dad to lung cancer. And I was at his house years ago, and he told me, he said, "Johnny, I'm glad that time goes by pretty quickly so I can see my dad again." You know, time does fly, and we're told in time we will see our loved ones again. David knew that Saul and Jonathan were close to him, and he missed them something awful. But David showed us ways that we can allow ourselves to grieve and to hurt, so that when this giant of grief comes our way, we can face it. Yeah, it may hurt, it may be pain, it may be something we are so uncomfortable feeling, but you know what? It's healthy. And that's what we need to understand. It's okay to grieve, it's okay to cry, it's okay to hurt and to miss people. God knows how we feel. Because you know, no matter what people say, God lost His Son too. God gave up His Son on the cross. And He knew the pain, and He knew the hurt. And we know the same thing. The Scripture tells us that grieving may last a while, but joy comes in the morning. And so if we can face this giant of grief, and we can move on, and we can find it through God's strength to help us, we can live for the morning, and we can find the joy that God can give us. Would you pray with me?